Good morning. My name is Lee Benham. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here on this occasion. Along with Mary Shirley and Alexander Benham, I've been working for some years with the Ronald Coase Institute. We'll talk more about that later, but that adds another wonderful dimension. I think we should just get into it now. Our first speaker, who will take 20 to 25 minutes, is Robert Hahn. He's at the Smith School at the University of Oxford, and he's going to talk to us. He's been involved in regulations for much of his career. His topic is the effect of allowance allocation on cap and trade system performance. Okay. Sorry,
Thank you for the introduction, although I'm not Bob Hahn. I'm Rob Stavins. I'm not from Oxford, I'm from Harvard. But Bob Hahn is with me. He's my co-author, and he is from Oxford. And this is work that we've done jointly, so thank you, Lee. Thank you to the organizers, of course, to Roger, Tom, and Richard. Bob and I both really appreciate having been included in this conference. As you can see, our topic is the effect of allowance allocations on cap and trade system performance. In other words, we're going to be looking at environmental markets and at a particular dimension of them, which we consider to be both interesting and also very important. We begin with the problem of social cost, as so many of us begin with, in particular with the Coase theorem, the notion that bilateral negotiations between the generator and the recipient of some kind of externality will in fact lead to the same outcome, and it'll be the efficient outcome, regardless of whether the initial property rights were assigned to the polluter or to the pollutee, and that holds if there are no transactions, costs, income effects, or third-party impacts. Now, we're going to focus on what we call the Coase lemma for environmental policy, which is directly related to that, and which has tremendous real-world significance in the environmental policy realm. And that is that the market equilibrium in a cap-and-trade system is cost-effective and is independent of the initial allocation of the tradable allowances. This independence of the equilibrium allocation of the performance and the cost of a cap-and-trade system for pollution from the initial allocation of allowances is of tremendous political importance, which is why this topic is important. And I'm going to explain how it is that where that political importance comes about. The question then that we're going to ask, motivated by the political importance of this, is when does this independence hold and when does it not? Under what conditions does it hold? Under what conditions is it violated? So here is an outline of the paper that Bob and I are writing. This outline may evolve, conditional upon your comments at this conference. It's also an outline of what we're going to have to say this morning. I'm going to start with a few words on the purpose and scope of the paper, and then I'll lay out the basic theory of the central finding from both partial and general equilibrium analyses. And then we'll turn to the heart of it first in terms of theory, and we'll look at the conditions under which independence can break down. And I say can because you'll see there are lots of qualifications. Transactions costs, uncertainty regarding future allowance prices, conditional allowance allocations. Then I'm going to turn it over to Bob, and he's going to talk about the effects of market power, an area in which he's done some important work, non-cost minimizing behavior by the market participants, and differential regulatory treatment. And then he'll, as really a forecast of where we're going, because we haven't done the empirical work yet, we just started to lay it out, he'll talk about the kind of empirical assessment we intend to do, both of existing cap and trade systems and also of the design of systems that are in legislation or on the books one way or another. And then finally he'll offer some tentative conclusions. So first, with regard to the purpose, the first purpose is that we want to try to convince you of the practical importance of the Coase lemma. And we want to ask whether or not that lemma has withstood the test of time, by which we mean whether or not this presumed independence actually turns out to be valid when you get into the details in terms of theory as well as in terms of practice. In terms of our scope, we're only looking at environmental policy. Obviously, the same kind of analysis assessment could be carried out in many other areas. And within the broad area of environmental economics, which is what Roger Knoll originally asked me to talk about, we're actually focusing only on cap and trade. So for those of you who don't know, brief statement, a cap and trade system is one where the government sets an overall cap, gives out or sells, but in some way conveys to firms the allowances, these rights, and then the firms can trade them. That's completely different from what we're not talking about, which are offsets, or environmental economists, we call them emission reduction credit systems. That's where there is no cap, but if you do something you wouldn't have normally done, you control pollution a little bit more, you generate a credit. That faces huge problems because it's a comparison with an unobservable hypothetical. We're not talking about those. This is not the offsets you can buy on an airplane. This is cap and trade systems as they're on the books and have been used, as Bob will take us through the empirics. Second, the next item on the scope is that we're only examining the sensitivity, this independence property, with regards to changes in the free allocation. How many go to Ohio as opposed to Missouri, for example? How many go to ExxonMobil as opposed to BP? We are not examining the impact on cost and performance of these systems of freely allocating versus auctioning, which is a huge area of both scholarly investigation and policy relevance and debate, in which we're both involved, but that's not what this paper is about. And then finally, we're not considering external effects of the trades, which is also a big issue in some parts of the U.S., actually. So in terms of the central findings from theory, the cap and trade systems, it's been known, it goes back to work in the 1960s, including the work, of course, of Professor Coase, but also Crocker and Dales. The cap and trade systems will result in a post-trading equilibrium in which the allocation is cost effective. That is, that marginal costs are equated across sources, not by intention, but that's the essential result of the trades, not surprisingly. And that, from work by David Montgomery, Journal of Economic Theory, 1972, the post-trading equilibrium is independent from the initial allocation. So that's the basic property. The independence property, as I've suggested, is absolutely of central importance. And I would argue, and I think Bob would agree, that the reason, in fact, why cap and trade systems have been used is because of this property. Because what it means is that the government can establish the overall cap for pollution, whether they do it on the basis of benefit-cost analysis, which might make you happy, or they do it on the basis of what is considered to be scientific testimony, religion, ideology, whatever the reason for establishing a particular cap. It can then be left up to a representative democracy, a Congress, a parliament, to fight over the pieces of the pie, and essentially to allocate the pieces of the pie in a way to build a constituency. So in 1990, the Clean Air Act amendments have a bribe for Senator Glenn called bonus allowances. That got Senator Glenn from Ohio to support the legislation. The key property, the independence lemma that we're investigating, is that has no effect whatsoever on the equilibrium allocation after the trades, and hence it has no effect on the environmental performance of the system, nor on the aggregate cost of the system, although obviously it has huge distributional implications, but not for aggregate environmental performance or cost. And experience has somewhat validated that, as we'll also be looking into. I want you to contrast this for a moment from your general presumption and mine regarding the process when legislation is introduced into a representative democracy. And in order to build that political constituency, whether it's healthcare policy this week or in January it's financial regulatory policy, the result of building the political constituency is typically, or at least frequently, to weaken the policy itself in terms of its aspirations, targets, and goals, or to drive up the cost of whatever is being achieved. So this is a tremendous departure from that kind of business as usual. That's why we consider it interesting and important. So let's take a look then. I'll begin and Bob will continue with, I'm going to talk about the first of the possible breakdowns in this marvelous independence, which is the existence of transactions costs. Obviously, transactions costs certainly arise in the exchange of allowances in a cap and trade system, and they can lead to the violation of independence. Now, at first blush, this comes directly from Coase, because after all, the Coase theorem was conditional upon a lack of transactions costs, but that notion that's in the problem of social cost has to do with the identity of the exclusive property right holder. Is it the polluter or the pollutee? What turns out is the more important question is what happens when you change the quantity. So the polluter or one polluter or another has a majority of the allowances, but what if they get one more or they get one less? When you have quantitative changes without actually this dichotomous change, does this have an effect? Does the independence remain? And the answer is that with constant marginal transactions costs, in other words, the transactions costs are the same no matter, thank you, no matter the size of the trade, the independence exists, except under some particular conditions I'll skip because of time. With increasing marginal transactions cost, the larger the trade, the larger the fee per unit of trade the lawyer charges. Independence is violated, but increasing marginal transactions costs we would assume are not sustainable because I can just break up my transaction into 3 small ones and therefore have lower fees to the lawyer. So that one we can sort of ignore, although if there are fixed transactions costs, that could be sustainable. And then finally, and most importantly, with decreasing marginal transactions costs, which are volume discounts, which is what we have on the transactions cost, the brokerage fees for everything from yachts to homes, whether they take a smaller percentage for the larger properties, volume discounts, independence is in fact violated. And I guess with the blackboard, which I don't have, I could show you the basic intuition, but anyway. So, next, uncertainty. So, uncertainty regarding the future allowance price, and there certainly is uncertainty over that, can lead to a violation of the independence. 2 properties would have to be there, though. One is that firms are risk averse, but that's not sufficient. It would also have to be that there are limits on transferability. Otherwise, in fact, the current prices would reflect that uncertainty under conditions of risk aversion. The consequences of this, which are interesting, is that, and not surprising, is that firms that have small allocations have an incentive to overinvest in abatement technology, to control extra, in order to hedge against the possibility of high future allowance prices, and they're having to buy allowances that are very expensive. And firms with very large initial allocations have an incentive to underinvest in abatement technology for the opposite reason, to hedge against possible low future allowance prices. Third, there are conditional allowance allocations. In other words, an allowance allocation which is made in such a way that through your behavior you can affect what is the size of the allocation. And we talk about this because it tends to be quite important in real-world policy now, in the form of what are called output-based updating allocation, which is your allocation as a firm, such as of CO2 emissions allowances, is conditional upon the level of your production of steel or cement or electricity in a previous period. Now that obviously functions as a production subsidy, and it very much affects the post-trading allocation, and it drives up abatement costs. Although Bob's going to talk about the empirics, I'm going to mention, so put this into context, that this is actually this kind of mechanism is in the Waxman-Markey legislation that was passed by a small margin by the House of Representatives. It's in the Kerry-Boxer legislation, which is the major vehicle for CO2 climate and other cap and trade in the U.S. Senate. And it's there in order for, you could either call it protectionist reasons or to protect firms from international competition, but for firms that are energy intensive and trade exposed. So think about sectors such as the cement industry, rolled steel, bulk glass, fossil fuels, and aluminum, a few others. The typical approach to dealing with that by the Europeans and Australians and their systems is just give them a lot of extra free allowances. Well, that makes the firms happy, and it may compensate them for losses in profits, but it does nothing for their international competitiveness because it's not on the margin, right? It's not marginal. And so it doesn't affect their marginal cost of production, their supply function. That's what matters in terms of my market share with competing with cement production from China, for example. The mechanism, however, which is in Waxman-Markey, this output-based one, not only compensates firms, but does affect them on the margin, and so can protect their quote-unquote international competitiveness, but it does so, of course, the protection, by having them produce more aluminum than they would have in the cost-effective equilibrium, so they're producing more pollution under the cap and trade system. Someone else has to control more, and that itself is a departure from cost effectiveness, so it drives up costs. Before I leave it, and in fact before I close, I'd say that the judgment of economists is, despite all the problems with this, it is probably better from an economic perspective than what the major alternative is in the real world, which are border adjustments. And I'm going to turn to Bob. Perfect timing. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank Richard and Tom and Roger for putting together this conference. And what are we on market power? I want to say, well, when I was at Caltech many years ago as a student under Roger Knoll, and my thesis related to the design of what we call the marketable permit scheme, what is now called the cap and trade scheme for limiting sulfur dioxide in Los Angeles. And there was a meeting that Roger was asked to go to as we were coming to the close of our research project for the California Air Resources Board, in which a number of the key CEOs from Los Angeles were there. And I didn't attend. I heard about this secondhand. And Roger got up and did the dog and pony show and essentially gave the light beer commercial. This is why this instrument is less filling and tastes great. You know, costs less and will achieve more environmental quality. And this is why we should be moving ahead with it. And one of the CEOs looked up briefly and said, "Yes, over my dead body." And I think that was the only time I can remember that Roger was actually rolled. So that was a clear exercise of raw political power, and it got me to thinking a little bit about my thesis. And I didn't actually include that in my thesis, but I did include a short section on market power. And as Rob noted, one of the key notions that came out of that and some related research is that the Coase lemma is violated under certain conditions. And you can see why if you think about it for a moment. If a firm is able to create or to influence the price in some way, it's going to be affected by whether it receives in the extreme no permits, let's say, or all the permits. It might act like a monopolist or a monopsonist. And that was the essence of that result. And there have been some bells and whistles added to it over time, including considering multiple markets and considering whether the competitive fringe complies perfectly or not. But I think the general result still obtains that it matters for efficiency how you hand out these permits. Later on, about 10 years after I got my PhD, I went to Washington. I journeyed to Washington and was involved as a bit player in trying to help design the SO2 allowance scheme, which is just another word for property rights, except among some interest groups. And during the heat of that battle, I was asked a poignant question by a very high-level civil servant at EPA, Rob Brenner. He asked me the question, "Well, gee, Bob, you guys have been doing these models for the last 20 years, and we're going to be regulating lots of utilities in the case of sulfur dioxide. What do you assume about the utility behavior in these models?" And I said, "Well, typically we assume that they're cost minimizers." And he said, "Well, what basis do you have for that?" And I said, "Not a lot." And so that's sort of the genesis of this slide, simply to suggest that if firms don't cost minimize, you could end up with behavior that's sensitive to the initial allocation of permits. And there are different sources of cost minimizing behavior that have been studied, some from behavioral economics, like the endowment effect. If you value your own endowment more highly than purchases on the open market, then independence might not hold. There may be some principal agent problems in terms of what the objectives the agents are versus the principals that could lead you astray in terms of not getting to a cost-effective outcome and certainly having an outcome that's dependent on the number of property rights you receive ex ante. And also Rob and I wrote a paper that talked about trading between nations and some trying to figure out what their objective function might be. And Roger and some of you in the audience have written about the fact that certainly in the, I see Sam, certainly in the area of regulation, we have 50 or so state regulators, and it's not always reasonable to expect that they will either treat this property right sensibly from an economic point of view, or indeed treat it in the same way across all 50 states. And that would also lead to cases in which the equilibrium allocation that you observe in the market is not independent of the initial allocation. So one question you might ask, and a really important question, is we could, theorists could go on forever and find exceptions to rules. How important is this stuff empirically? And I think at this point, the answer that Rob and I would give is we're not sure, because we haven't done a careful empirical assessment. What we hope to do is do a careful review of the literature, some of which tries to tease out directly through using instrumental variable techniques and other techniques whether in fact this independence result obtains. We also are going to use another indirect approach where the list of conditions that Rob presented at the beginning will look at a number of markets and ask whether they've been violated or they haven't been violated. Just one more anecdote, if you'll indulge me, related to the SO2 scheme. I was involved, again, as a bit player in the White House drafting group for the Clean Air Act, and in particular the allowance trading mechanism. And at one point we were getting into rather serious arguments about which utilities should receive how many permits and so forth. And evidently one day there was a meeting between the Chief of Staff, John Sununu, and some senators, including Alan Simpson. And Simpson basically conveyed the following sentiment to Sununu. He said, "You guys write the bill, let us handle the distributional part." And I think at the end of the day, that really is the takeaway of this Coase insight. No matter what we find empirically, that's what drives in a big way the political preference for this instrument over some other instruments. So, in the interest of time, I'm just going to say that we're going to look at a whole suite of market-based approaches, many of which you're familiar with, some of which are still on the drawing board, like U.S. cap and trade, and ask the question: to what extent is this independence result validated or violated? Here are interim findings after 50 years. We think that the Coase insight, which we're calling the lemma or the corollary, is very important in the environmental policy domain. It's frequently, but not always, satisfied, certainly to a first-degree approximation, and it's exceptionally important politically. So let me stop there and ask Lee what he wants to do. Not sure what's wrong here.
Very nice, thank you. Well, we have some time now for some questions and some people who would be happy to answer it. So, yes. You need to speak up if you could, please.
One place where the independence might be violated is actually in the size of the cap. And I think that was the experience in Europe, that the initial number of allowances grew larger than it should have been, so ultimately not much was accomplished in those initial years. And I think that that's cap and trade can be a beautiful thing if it's implemented right, but it surely politicians that just love making a commitment that looks like they're doing something in 2050, and yet they're not around in 2050.
So, can you hear me if I just respond? Yeah. So, I'll try to follow. So I think you're absolutely correct that binding policies are not binding. So I agree with your insight. I think your interpretation of the European Union emissions trading scheme part of this law, that what you're referring to is the pilot phase, not the current Kyoto phase where it's meaningful, it's binding. However, it's not terribly binding because there is a global recession. That's good news, not bad news, because cap and trade systems, as demonstrated by that, on the cycle, as opposed to a carbon tax, which continue to punish private industry, even though emissions were down during the period of recession. During that pilot phase to which you referred, there was not an objective of reducing emissions per se, it was to test out the instrument. As a result of that, if you missed by a small amount, what did you do? You actually had this headroom, which is what you're characterizing, and that's quite true. So it was a valid statement with regards to that pilot phase. But I don't think that that's a fair characterization, surprisingly perhaps, because one would think that we would see that a lot, but I don't think that's a fair characterization of what we've seen of the history of the 15 or so applications that have been of cap and trade systems. They've actually been quite binding.
I just want to react to that a little bit differently.
Can everyone hear? Why don't you come to the mic here?
Well, another way of interpreting your question, Peter, is to recognize that some things are really outside of the domain of the Coase lemma in some sense, which is to say that the target you choose depends on the overall political environment. It could depend on how you give out permits. I mean, you could imagine giving out permits, proposing to give out permits in a really silly way, not getting agreement, so you end up with the status quo. So that's really all I wanted to say about that. There's some relationship between the target and the instrument that is clearly outside of the Coase lemma.
I have two questions. First one is whether
Could I make a suggestion? When you ask a question, could you give your name, please, because we don't know everyone here.
David Weiss out of UChicago Law School. First question is, I wonder how many of the conditions are violated. So how many of these conditions that cause cost mechanisms to be violated for cap and trade also cause a tax not to be cost mechanism? When I went through it as we were talking, I thought quite a few of them with the tax would still work, whereas cap and trade wouldn't. And of course taxes have the same political advantage because we give away tax credits just to give away reallocation. So I thought it would be useful to compare taxes for all these conditions and say when they're better and when they're not. The second question is I want to ask about the border taxes versus reallocation. I think the literature actually went that way. And I wanted you to comment more on the lines on that housing paper, which I don't think really supports that proposition that reallocation is better than border taxes.
So I actually couldn't hear your second question, therefore I'll answer the first question, and either Bob will answer the second, or maybe you can restate it. So the answer to your first question is, first of all, we have not, but that sounds like an interesting future paper to make a comparison across policy instruments on some of these issues. But I think that there is a very important issue, which is at the heart of this paper, of the contrast between a cap and trade system and a roughly equivalent carbon tax. So I think it's an important question that is at the heart of the paper. And it's as follows. Both systems, a carbon tax and a cap and trade system, can be designed to look exactly like the others. So I could describe at length a carbon tax that would be identical in all its properties, essentially, to a cap and trade, and likewise. So one can do that in the classroom. Having said that, though, there are important differences between them. And they come up in the real world, in the political world. So this is in the realm of political economy. And that is that both systems are subject to tremendous political pressures. Now, we know from experience the political pressures working on a tax. We saw it, for example, with the Clinton-era BTU tax proposal, but we see it repeatedly. The way they tend to manifest themselves is firms coming forward, sectors coming forward, and say, exempt us from it. We're the aluminum industry. We are unbelievably energy intensive. We're trying to compete with Korea and China. Exempt us from the BTU tax. You're out. Thank you. And that's the point of sensitivity, is exemption from the tax. Each time you exempt a firm or sector from a carbon tax, for example. It reduces the environmental performance, and because you take some low-cost emissions reductions opportunities off the table, it reduces cost effectiveness as well. Those same political pressures exist, of course, with a cap-and-trade system. The lobbying is huge. But, and this is the interesting property that we're investigating, there's a margin provided, a safety valve, if you will, in a cap-and-trade system, and that is those lobbyists can go instead, the firms can go instead, to get a larger share of the initial allocation of allowances, which, the independence property, unless certain things mess up, tends to result in the same level of environmental protection and cost effectiveness.
I'm sorry, that's my second question. Quick response. If the Ways and Means Committee says tax credits for sale instead of exemptions for sale, just like the Energy Committee and Ronald Committee said pre-allocations for sale instead of exemptions for sale, then you get the same political effect. I don't see why that would be different. So let's make clear that we're always going to have a price in the margin. We're giving away the base, right? If that's made public, that's what we're giving away. You give us contributions, we give you the base, then that's fine, right?
Well, I understand that numerically and conceptually, a cap-and-trade system, an upstream cap-and-trade system, particularly with the allowances auctioned, is identical to a tax. The reality is that the perception is very different. I'm speaking on the basis of experience, not upon theory. So I don't disagree, with your characterization. The Republican characterization of cap-and-trade as cap-and-tax is accurate. That is how it functions downstream. But that's not the perception, and that's not the way they've worked out in practice. That's what we're interested in looking at. Did you want to?
Yes, yes, you want to follow? Yes.
The question I have about this is, in a sense, a sort of a follow-up to what you were just discussing. Assuming firms can project what their liability is likely to be, or benefits are likely to be under a cap-and-trade system, and assuming that their political lobbying reflects that exception, and assuming that the frontier is elastic if the pressure on the Congress or the legislature is strong enough, that is, the accumulation of pressure, what is the feature of the cap-and-trade system that makes it so different from one of the other ways that almost penalize players for emissions? You follow the set of assumptions I was making?
I didn't understand the last part, which was your comparison. What the feature is?
Let me do it again quickly. I'm a firm. I look at the cap-and-trade system, I guess what my response would be, and I look to see what financial impact would be on it. I watch other lobbyists also doing the same thing. Eventually, I and the Congress figure out that within what was the original nominal frontier, we can't satisfy all the claims that are being made to remove the frontier. Now, that's an assumption about the way the political process works, that it's not going to ultimately optimize the amount of emissions. It's going to satisfy some subject to all the pressure. So my question is, why is that different from the kind of swapping around and so on that would go on under a carbon tax? That is, it seems to me you would do exactly the same thing. You would calculate, I'm sitting out there as a firm, and I calculate the impact of all this, and I make the kinds of claims you were talking about, and eventually Congress adds up my claims, and it sort of adjusts the system to try to accommodate as many of them as it can.
Let me take a crack at this. I think the real answer is it appears to be different because, the political dynamics, whatever that means, appears to be different because we seem to observe in the real world a movement towards using these, loosely speaking, market-based quantity instruments. I don't think we fully understand why. I think yours and David's question point out that in some sense there's something like a Ricardian equivalence. You could end up with the same bargaining and the same outcome. My intuition, and I'm not sure where Rob is on this, and mine's dated, and I'd be interested to see what you thought, Roger, is that environmental groups feel more comfortable with the illusion that they are getting a fixed quantity, and in some sense that may be more saleable to their constituencies, and they are an important set of interest groups here. But I don't have a complete answer to your question.
Well, what I could
add to that. It doesn't disagree with it, but add to what Bob said by not hypothesizing what the environmental interest groups think, but telling you what they think. And that is, their perspective is that the worst possible thing, I'm not arguing this on the merits, I'm just positive terms, that the worst possible way to have the debate on an environmental policy from their perspective would be to focus on a number, which is the cost, as opposed to a number, which is the quantity of pollution, a bad thing. Okay? And that's the primary that's a way in which they would actually literally have characterized in discussions I've had why they would not support a carbon tax. The other way goes to the heart of what I responded to David's question, and that is someone who is extremely prominent in the environmental movement has frequently said we could never get a carbon tax high enough to do the job. We can get a cap-and-trade system stringent enough to do the job. That's their judgment, but that's their judgment based upon 50 years of experience, since the first Earth Day.
Yes.
It seems to me that if I lobby for a tax exemption, yeah, that's a good idea.
Yes, okay. Bob Clear from Berkeley. If I lobby for a tax exemption, it seems to me that there's no particular reason why other members, other polluters, should either favor or resist my lobbying efforts for an exemption. But if I lobby for an expansion and a cap, then everybody who already owns pollution rights recognizes that they're going to be devalued if the cap is lifted. So they have a reason to resist the raising of the cap. Therefore, it seems to me there is an asymmetry here, and it's always going to exist insofar as the government it's the government who owns the revenues, and therefore the taxpayers who are at risk with respect to a tax. Whereas with respect to a cap, it's the grandfathered people who have the initial obligation of rights who are at risk with respect to the tax. So with respect to the cap. So I would have thought that's just the fundamental difference in the way the politics is going to work. But that's all theory. You guys know the facts.
Well, so I think that makes sense, and I certainly agree with that for a situation in which you already have a system in place, and some firms, those incumbent firms, already have allowances which would be devalued as a result of an expansion of the cap. But that's different from you're starting from ground zero, and there's a discussion about what would be the size of the cap. In that case, I would go back to the reality that I described before. But it's a good point.
Richard? Yeah, just a brief question talking about the sort of difference in the political economy. Richard Epstein, University of Chicago, and the difference in the political economy between the caps on the one hand and the taxes on another. If you're an environmental group and there turns out to be a cap-and-trade system, it seems to me that one possibility that's open to you is to go into the marketplace and to buy some of these various allocations from just retirement. So that what happens is you can reduce production. I don't see any particular thing that you can do with the tax system, which would give you exactly the same thing. And so I wonder whether or not that would be sensible. Because to give you the other analogy to this is that in many cases when environmental groups are interested in stuff, what they do is they go out and they buy land and then they sort of take it off the market for certain kinds of productions and then release it or resell it at other times. So my sense is I would always prefer cap and trade on the ground instead of making environmental groups strictly political actors who actually now start to make them economic actors. Does this make any sense or not?
So, two comments that I would make. One is that clearly there would be more interest if we had presented a paper on the political economy of cap and trade versus carbon taxes as opposed to property of cap and trade itself. But we'll do that next time. For the 200th birthday, we'll come back and do that. But to the point of your question, Richard, actually that has been observed. But they tend to be student groups in law schools, including this law school. So if you go to the website for the SO2 allowance trading program at EPA, you'll see the purchases of allowances, which presumably, they then tear up. We hope they don't burn them or they're contributing carbon dioxide. And it's a very large number in terms of the number of purchases. It's an extremely small share in terms of the tons of allowances. But you're right. I think it's a remarkable property of a cap-and-trade system. Brings a tear to my eye that an individual member of the population can go forward and they can change. They can render more stringent, not weaker, more stringent an act of Congress signed by the President of the United States. I mean, it's pretty powerful stuff. Right?
John?
John Lyon, George Mason. So, given your comments about the different ways different taxes and caps are perceived, have you thought about the ways in which the non-compliance or transactions costs with maintaining compliance or avoiding it, or introducing substitution effects in other industries are going to affect your cost theorems? So in other words, there are different ways of cheating, both in taxation and cap and trade, and the ways of being avoided. So you already suggested by different kinds of legislation, but the ways of cheating around it, or like responding to it, or indirect responses, such as how that will induce other industries or other countries unaffected by these things to vary their production schemes or do things you have to have to make some non-compliance and substitution. Are there any systematic things we can say about this which either is validated directly, so say on its own, versus in comparison to taxation?
I know in the market power literature there was one paper that we had up there that talks about non-compliance, and it actually turns out to diminish market power, but I don't remember the result on cost effectiveness. But your point is well taken, that if you have non-compliance, then you could end up with a violation of the lemma.
So, I mean, more generally speaking, I'm not if I understood, it's certainly true that, to a first order approximation, the smaller the political jurisdiction relative to in a relative sense, in which this cap-and-trade system exists, but I'm about to say, by the way, applies for any policy, not just cap-and-trade, the greater is the amount of so-called leakage, just economic spillage that'll take place. You cut emissions here, but now it's more costly to produce steel within here. It's cheaper, relatively speaking, outside, so some steel production shifts outside, pollution increases out here, at the same time we reduced it here. That's not special to cap-and-trade. That's true of any policy instrument in this realm.
Yes.
Vernon Smith, Chapman University. I think in terms of, there's certain principles that make cap and trade and the carbon tax quite different. If you think of the problem as one of changing the property right regime, okay, in the past, water, air, whatever the resource is, was plentiful, and one didn't have to worry about assigning rights to it. Now, that's no longer true. And so you're asking how now to introduce, change that property right regime. Well, I think from that perspective, the cap and trade is very natural, in that the basic idea is to award rights to pollute to everyone based upon some kind of historical baseline. And what you're doing is recognizing their past rights to pollute, okay? And you make that a tradable right. Now, you're going to gradually increase the standards for clean air or clean water. And when you introduce a market, that market is a discovery pricing process. This is what Coase was talking about earlier when he talked about we have to create a market. He's talking about the people inside the market, not the people outside. He's talking about the people that are inside the market. And as prices form, they'll start to then ask themselves, well, wait a minute, maybe I better find out more about what it might cost to clean up. And so people start making these comparisons. Now, it is true that in equilibrium, there is a theorem. And that equilibrium price is equivalent to an optimal tax. Okay? But we do not describe or even try to describe tax discovery processes in the sense of that modeling whoever it is setting the tax and asking how he might change the tax. So what tax do you begin with? And in the cap and trade system, you begin with a baseline allocation of rights to pollute, crank up the standard, and then the prices start to form. Now, have you,
2 points. The second point is going to be to agree and then to respond. But the first point is going to be to offer a different view, to question a little bit your premise. And that is that it is possible. Now I'm going to be taking the side of those who seem to like carbon taxes better. It is possible to design a pollution tax which is symmetric and essentially has the properties that you were talking about. So in terms of recognizing this prior right to pollute, I can have a pollution tax system in which I rebate the revenue on the basis of emissions in a historical year. That's identical to giving them out. So there are tons of symmetries between them. There are some places where there are not symmetries, and I had mentioned this political asymmetry. There's also an asymmetry that was pointed out by my colleague Marty Weitzman in 1974 in his famous, well-known paper, Prices versus Quantities, in which he was interested in centrally planned economies, but it applies a lot to environmental pollution, and looking at how it was that you would anticipate differences in efficiency between price and quantity instruments under conditions of cost uncertainty. It is true that if you use a tax system, you don't know what quantity of pollution you're going to get, and you might iterate it towards it. But the economist's answer typically to that is, well, wait, why are we talking about quantities in the first place? What we should be doing is putting in the right tax, which is the size of the social damages at the point at which marginal benefits equal marginal costs, right? That's the efficient level of control, and that's the right. That's the Pigouvian tax. And so that would be their response to it.
I was going to...
Harold? I didn't get too much sleep last night, so maybe I dozed off when you talked about it. In which case I apologize. I don't know why there's not more focus on the government instead of on the...
Could you get closer to the mic?
I don't know why there's not more focus on how the government can use these two systems. Rather than just focusing on to whom the system is applied. In principle, you could use the cap and trade without any revenue flowing to the government. In principle, you cannot use a tax system without any revenue flowing to the government. I don't know how to equate these two systems in that dimension. And because they're not equatable in that dimension, it seems to me that the tax system is much more subject to abuse by a government that wants to use money for lots of different things.
I'm not sure that I agree with you. You certainly could imagine a tax subsidy system, as Rob was alluding to earlier, and impose a constraint that of revenue neutrality, at least in an expected value sense.
If that's true, you could imagine that. But can you imagine a government operating that way? That's my point. Once you create an opportunity to collect revenue, there's a great incentive to change the system in favor of revenue flow.
I agree with that. And I think some of those same concerns arise with cap and trade as well if you auction off the property rights. And as Mike and David and several others pointed out, looking at the political economy of these two instruments is an interesting project.
I mean, what's interesting about cap and trade is that you have the government incentives working essentially in balance with the private sector lobbying incentives, because with a cap and trade system, it's surely in the interest of the government to auction 100% of the allowances, which you may recall was President Obama's proposal originally, was 100%, because it's a huge generator of revenue. In the case of CO2, we're talking about well over $500 billion of revenue that we're getting to in the out years annually. However, it's precisely the opposite incentive structure from the regulated community. They want 0% auction. They want 100% free allocation. It's the fight between those that results in something which is at neither of the extremes, although historically it has almost always been at the extreme of free allocation.
We have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Mm-hmm.
that the firms that receive the permits will just sell the permits.
Right.
And so I think this complicates the story because, at least with certain types of sources, the system may have to be defined by state law, which may mean something like what we're talking about, allocating the permits in accordance with the production levels or something like that, which would then interfere with the that's why I think the interest group problems may spill over into the design system in a way that we're sort of set up as quite contemplated. You sort of see the system operating in a perfect fashion with the interest groups being totally handled through the distribution and allocation.
I think it's a very good comment, and I took note and will include it. I should say that, so we are looking, implicitly, we're looking at the activities of some interest groups, obviously, primarily private industry lobbyists. That's the main one that infiltrates this, but also the environmental community. But you're right, labor unions are, potentially important. There are two ways in which I think that intersects with this work and with cap and trade systems, and I'll use two real-world examples for it. One is what we're seeing right now in California, where under AB 32, which Roger knows a lot about, there is a proposal for a cap and trade system, and localized interest groups, which are referred to as the environmental justice community in California. Those localized interest groups want to essentially, not intentionally, but screw up the cap and trade system. Not allow trades, essentially, have a cap and trade system without trading because of concerns about localized impacts, not necessarily on labor, but on correlated pollutants. So that same problem always comes up, but it came up in 1990 under the Clean Air Act amendments that Bob worked on because of the fact that there would be an anticipated shift to low sulfur coal in the Powder River Basin from Appalachia. Appalachian coal mines deep shaft are unionized. Out west, strip mining is not in the Powder River Basin, and so the United Mine Workers were very, very opposed to the policy. Now, what you could have done was what Senator Byrd wanted, which was to tie the hands of the cap and trade system. He had a proposal which was going to cost 4 times as much nationally, because there wouldn't be any trading. What they did instead, and the credit goes actually to the late Senator Kennedy from Massachusetts, was that they put a buy-off in, but not inside the legislation. Simultaneously, they passed a $250 million jobs retraining program and payout program to Appalachia to address what was a very serious distributional impact, you could say, but they didn't do it by affecting the cap and trade system.
Let's give our speakers a hand. Sorry to cut discussion off, but we do need to try to stay on schedule. Thank you very much. The next talk is going to be a paper by Gary Leibkap, Dean Luke, and Trevor O'Grady, and it deals with the spread of rectangular surveys. So, Gary, it's all yours.
Well, it's great to be here, and certainly the first presentation and discussion was fun. This, too, is a presentation about some work in progress. Let me see if I know how to move this forward. Okay. And what we're going to deal with here are the role of transactions costs and markets and agricultural land markets and some institutional reforms that have played an important role in expanding agricultural land markets. And this is going to be a move back in time because we're going to look at some institutional reforms in the 18th and 19th centuries. As already we all know, we owe a great deal of debt to Ronald Coase in terms of his emphasis in developing our understanding of the role of transactions costs and how they can importantly impact the nature of market activities as well as the nature of non-market activities and what gets included in contracts and what doesn't have to be included in explicit contracts. And as I said, our focus here is on property rights, the way in which property rights are demarcated to land, an important institutional innovation, and we're interested in the spread of that institutional innovation. And in particular, so we're going to borrow on really a great debt that we owe to Ronald Coase, but also to others, Doug North and others, in terms of the development and spread of the rectangular system of demarcating land within the British Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries. So why, when we've been talking about cap and trade and the immediacy of all that, would we want to do this? Well, this is, I think, we get some good insights in the importance of how institutions can promote markets. And yet institutions are costly, and so they're not going to be uniformly adopted. And so there are going to be conditions under which these institutions are adopted. And I think this gives us a nice opportunity to understand the parameters or the factors that determine when institutions that lower transactions costs can be adopted and when they might not be. Now, the time period we're looking at is an interesting one because this is really when land markets were so familiar and used to having rapidly evolving and active land markets to recall that this has not always been the case. Certainly in Western Europe, in the latter part of the 17th and early part of the 18th century, land markets start to take off as you had a lot of customary constraints upon heirs being reduced and other constraints on inalienability put aside. This is part of the Industrial Revolution. It gets incorporated into the English enclosure movement and other market reforms. There are also some technological changes in terms of surveying and measurement. And the importance is that land was becoming increasingly a vital element of emerging commercial economies. And so we wanted new opportunities to consolidate land, put it into plots that were usable, and move land not only within agriculture but also to urban and industrial uses. And coincidentally, this move to greater land market activity in Europe, in Western Europe, coincides with the advent of vast amounts of new land being made available to European immigrants, and particularly English immigrants, with the opening up of the frontier colonies throughout the world. And so these are colonies that are land. And we're now going to have the opportunity to put this land potentially into productive use and to adopt institutional innovations that are being discussed in England and in Europe, possibly without the same constraints. And so this is part of the motivation for this study. And so there are two major ways of demarcating land, at least that we focus on. The traditional one is meets and bounds, and I'll show you some good examples of that, but that basically is defining the perimeters of land by local characteristics, trees, rocks, and other topography. So this is very idiosyncratic. It requires a lot of local information, and it also means generally that parcels are going to be irregularly shaped, often awkwardly shaped for production, and certainly awkwardly shaped for land market transactions, particularly if you want to expand the range of the market. And so the innovation was the rectangular survey, that is to put land into understandable coordinated squares. Okay? So we'd have uniform boundaries, uniform shapes. These shapes are not only more productive, but the land becomes more of a commodity. It's something understandable, and we can define this alignment of these parcels with regard to something broader than local idiosyncratic characteristics, and this ought to broaden land markets. And so what we're interested in this project that the three of us are working on is the adoption of this process, or lack of it, within the British Empire. And so we're going to have a common political jurisdiction and a common legal structure within this process. This summarizes here some of the characteristics of the two ways of demarcating land, and some of you have seen this as part of another aspect of this study, which has turned out to have any number of areas that we're moving. But basically, as I said, meets and bounds defines parcel shape and description in terms of local characteristics. These are idiosyncratic. as compared to the rectangular survey, which puts things into squares. This is a grid. There is a location system that all parcels within that location are aligned and their addresses are with respect to. In the case of new movement into land or new claiming, you survey first under the rectangular survey, then the claimant appears as compared to the older arrangement under meets and bounds where individuals move in, claim land, and then survey. Under the meets and bounds system, there's no necessary alignment of properties, and so boundaries are very haphazard as compared to the rectangular survey where property boundaries are aligned. They can be aligned as they are in North America with regards to latitude and longitude, or they can be aligned in other smaller areas with regards to rivers or some other factors. But the point is that they're aligned. So it then becomes easier to build infrastructure, roads along the frontages of property as compared to going across the fingers or irregular parts of other processes. And the important thing as well, as I mentioned before, you now can have much broader information about what you're buying for land markets, and you know what you're buying, and it's going to be much more uniform as compared to the very localized information that's available under meets and bounds. And as I said, increasingly with new developments in agriculture that are taking place at this time, especially in field agriculture, it requires that field units be put into productive shapes, and those productive shapes are squares. And so this is all of these factors are aligning towards pressure for the adoption of the grid. This gives you a good sense, I think, of how cumbersome the meets and bounds system. This is from and for people from law schools, this will be old hat, but for the economists, this is a little surprising, probably. This is from North America, but you can see the amount of information that would be necessary to define property boundaries or to demarcate land under meets and bounds, and how idiosyncratic that is, as compared to the simplicity of and the permanence of the definition of property under the rectangular survey. Now, you required size. There are scale effects. You could have, and so I added this slide to let you see that you could still have small parcels of land aligned, re-subdivided and put into a grid, but you still would not capture all the public goods associated with uniform alignment and proper productive shapes and so forth. If, as you see on the right or on your left, you have multiple parcels subdivided and put into grid, but where they collide, you still get this non-alignment and awkwardly shaped parcels. So there are advantages to having larger amounts of land uniformly put into the grid. Here, I want to continue to show you the importance of this, and then we'll get into the analysis that were taking place this underway. Here, these are both flat pieces of land, two areas. One is pure meets and bounds, and then we've just digitized the parcel boundaries. As you can see, just how cumbersome and how unproductive many of these shapes are likely to be, and what a potential hindrance this could be for land markets, as compared to the simplicity of the rectangular grid. And then finally, and maybe most dramatically, this is a contemporary shot from Google Earth in southern Arizona. And so essentially we have the same land put to the same use, and generally owned by the same people. On the one hand, we have U.S. production on one side of the Colorado River, and you can see the neat squares associated with the rectangular survey, and then the Mexican side of production. Again, it's generally the same crops, and there is some movement towards squares, but you can see it's not aligned, not in any real aligned fashion, and so and the Mexican system is under meets and bounds. So I think it sort of dramatizes the important impact of this kind of a demarcation system. Now, at the time period that we're looking at, the advantages of the rectangular system of survey to demarcate property were reasonably well understood. Dean and I are working on the surprising use of the grid under the Roman Empire. Most of the Po Valley and much of the most productive areas of North Africa were placed into a rigid grid for land use. And as I mentioned, in some areas in Britain under the enclosure movement, one of the aims was to reorganize land into more productive units and consolidate parcels and so forth as part of the enclosure movement. This knowledge was borrowed directly in congressional debates in the United States in 1785 with the land law that has subsequently determined how all land west of the Pennsylvania-Ohio border would be allocated under the rectangular survey. And they consciously make, in these debates, make reference to the importance of a rectangular survey as compared to meets and bounds to reduce border disputes, to promote land market exchanges, to make sure that land is put into productive shapes, and that individuals are not allowed to independently carve out portions of land that they would like and then leave other parts of land, less valuable land, potentially unclaimed. So you'd end up with a kind of a crazy quilt of claimed and unclaimed land and odd shapes. And so these are all part of the congressional debates over the federal land law, and they're quite similar to what you read in some of the discussions of early English enclosures. The British Colonial Office in the latter part of the 18th and early 19th century actually sent circulars out to colonial governments requesting that they survey land prior to settlement and ensure that these lands be placed into a grid. And one of the most famous advocates of this was Edward Wakefield, a British colonial leader who was importantly involved in the design of the colony of South Australia, New Zealand, and then came back later for Canada. And so why I mention this is the understanding of the role of the rectangular survey as an alternative way to demarcate land was well established at the time of the establishment of the British Empire. Now, I've hypothesized a number of advantages, and these are claimed in these debates. Actually, Dean and I, and Dean, a graduate student of his, and I have actually been looking at this and two other earlier aspects of this process to see whether or not the hypothesized advantages of the rectangular survey actually exist. And so I just want to briefly remind you of those or touch on those. In the case that Dean and I look at, this is a natural experiment that in Ohio, and what's interesting about this is as an outcome of negotiations among the states after the Revolutionary War and the adoption of the new constitutional form of government. Virginia was given a section of Ohio to pay its Revolutionary War veterans. And Virginia is a meets and bounds state. Now, it isn't, and so this land was made available as in warrants for those soldiers. Now, those soldiers didn't migrate to Ohio, but their warrants were picked up by brokers and then used to sell to immigrants who were migrating to the region. The surrounding area is all rectangular survey, and this is the meets and bounds area. And so what we're able to do using the 1850 and 1860 censuses, we have the original parcel maps for the area, and then from the 1850 and 1860 censuses, we have land values, we have the characteristics of the individuals who are involved. We also have information on topography and soil quality and river density and very early road maps. So we can actually then do a comparison of the two areas, one under meets and bounds and the other under the rectangular survey. And so this is what we find. The meets and bounds area in the Virginia Military District has dramatically more land conflicts over property boundaries because the parcels are very irregularly shaped And as I pointed out earlier, they're all defined with respect to boundaries that require local knowledge or that are not permanent. And so, in fact, we looked at all of the court cases at the Ohio Supreme Court in the 19th century over land boundary disputes. And over the entire century, there are 18 times more land conflicts over property boundaries in the small 3 million acre section of Ohio than the rest of Ohio combined. And actually, we looked at the 1870 census where you can get the number of lawyers per capita, and there are far more lawyers per capita in these counties than elsewhere in Ohio. So this was a hotbed of land dispute. But we're also able to get information from Ohio State reports on land transactions. And as predicted, you get far more land transactions in terms of conveyances and mortgages in the surrounding area as compared to the Virginia Military District lands. And again, these lands are virtually the same, and they have virtually the same people. We have far more road density. In the rectangular survey areas, roads, as I said, are built along the frontages of property lines, and then you do not have the problem of negotiating with property owners around very awkwardly shaped parcels. And this gets capitalized into land values, and land values, all else equal, are about 20% higher in the rectangular survey area as compared to the meets and bounds area. And so then what we do is do a little cost-benefit analysis, because as I'm going to talk about shortly, this is not cheap to do this. There are upfront costs to the rectangular survey in terms of controlling entry, surveying prior to entry, so land is delayed from in production for that period. And so we have information on this, and so nevertheless, for this 6 million acres, sort of combining the two areas, we get a gain of about $22 million for that little section of Ohio in $1860 relative to, just putting it in context, you see it's about a quarter the size of the whole state. So there are some economic advantages, the economic advantages that were part of the debate about why you would want to put land into a grid. Our second example, I'll just go over very briefly, jumps across the continent to California, and you can see all those grid, that's the rectangular survey, and then the haphazard areas, those are the Mexican and Spanish land grants. And so what we do is look at one in Monterey County, and essentially this is the grid area. You can see it over with a contemporary Google Earth map, and that's the Spanish land grant. And again, we use 1860 census information, and because we have fewer controls here, I think we overstate the advantages. But nevertheless, we get more improved land because land is in more usable shapes under the rectangular survey, and we get far higher land values within the rectangular survey as compared to meets and bounds. So, with that background and the fact that there was an emphasis on placing this throughout the British Empire, our empirical task is to see the degree to which and the determinants to which this is actually adopted. And so we are collecting information on the 18th and 19th century British Empire. We have an analytical framework that I'll very briefly describe, an estimation strategy, and we're now assembling the data to test some hypotheses about it. This is our schematic about the British Empire. Of course, the U.S. is very briefly in the empire, but it is part of the empire at the time that this knowledge base about this institution is coming about. These are the other places that we are looking at. Many of these have multiple colonies, so we'll have not only numerous observations, but you'll see shortly we have a great deal of variation in adoption. Here we've collected information on the initial settlement sites for North America, for instance, and so we have actual settlement maps, and then also historical discussions about whether land was surveyed first and put into a grid or whether it was governed by meets and bounds. Okay. And so, as I said, there is considerable variation. Most of the original 13 colonies, nevertheless, are under meets and bounds. The subsequent states of Kentucky and Tennessee, eastern Canada, Newfoundland, New South Wales, parts of Victoria and Australia, get mixed in New England, mixed in Tasmania, rectangular survey in Ohio, of course, in western U.S., Manitoba, western Canada, South Australia, Western Australia, parts of New Zealand. We're unsure at this point about Queensland, the settlement parts of Kenya, although discussions there talk about allocating land in 160 acre allotments, settlement parts of South Rhodesia, the 4 separate colonies of South Africa, as well as other English colonies. And so right now we're completing the analysis of sort of the left-hand side of just what kind of a land demarcation was put into place. The analytical framework that's motivating this, and I'll describe the other control variables shortly, but they're sort of individuals, if they're left on their own, have an incentive then to maximize the value of their land, subject to the cost of claiming, marking, and enforcing their claims. But if they act in an uncoordinated manner, will get land parcels sort of looking like the meets and bounds you saw earlier. On the other hand, because there are public goods associated with coordinated claiming with aligned boundaries and a uniform address system, we have a different group maximization problem. But again, there are upfront costs, and we're incorporating these upfront costs in our analysis. So we argue essentially that the rectangular survey will increase in value. Its net value will increase in the size of the governed areas I described, the expected time horizon and sense control, because you have upfront costs, and so we have to capitalize back the benefits over time. Expected land quality, and particularly in the homogeneity of land quality. A temperate climate, because it's, after all, going to be carried forward by European settlers. And it will decrease in implementation time. Terrain ruggedness reduces, because it increased costs, reduces the advantages of the rectangular survey and the cost of implementing it. Land quality and water access heterogeneity, where land is very heterogeneous, then it becomes more problematical to force people into predefined areas, because then it requires subsequent acquisition and exchange. Population growth of the settlement will increase control costs as well as native population density. We're right now using a linear probability model, 1 or 0, but actually as we're digitizing these, I think we'll be able to have a more continuous left-hand side variable. These are the other control variables that we're collecting: soil quality, and it's amazing how much you can get. Variation, terrain, river density, deviation from temperature and precipitation, so attractiveness for European settlers, density of the native population, non-English population, immigrant population growth rates as I described, the disease environment, and this borrows from Acemoglu and others, whether or not there was a land settlement company. And even anecdotally, you see that where there is a land settlement company, such as the South Australia Company or the British East India Company or so forth, or East African Company, these are companies that went out and recruited settlers, they surveyed in advance and then brought them in because they expected to capitalize and capture the returns from implementing the rectangular survey, and whether it was a crown or charter colony. So to conclude, what I've done is to describe an ongoing research project that involves a fundamental institution of property and property rights, land demarcation. It certainly builds on the insights of Ronald Coase. This institution has an important role in describing how transactions costs might be reduced and how you might promote land markets if it's cost effective to implement this institutional change. And so there are going to be trade-offs in adoption that we're analyzing in this analysis. We're looking at a common jurisdiction with a common legal tradition and generally similar people. This process adds to the existing literatures on the importance of beneficial institutions for economic growth and how those institutions are adopted. Harold was key in sort of laying out the role and determinants of when property rights would emerge, and Doug and he and John Wallace and Barry Weingast in their new book on the role of institutions in economic growth. But there's just a very large literature. Generally speaking, though, this literature focus is sort of a broad sweep, naturally, focusing on law and order or the protection of property rights and how this kind of broad institutional structure gets passed on. And what we're going to be able to do in this much more micro-focused analysis is to look how a specific institution dealing with the most important input in production, at least at the time, land, how this gets passed on or not within the British Empire. So thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Very nice. So we'll have some questions now. Yes.
Edward Ronald with FCC. Not surprisingly, this paper stimulates some thoughts about
Could you a little closer to the mic, please?
How we define property rights in the spectrum, and even on the question of rectilinear rectangular boundaries, that issue is currently relevant to what's going on in the spectrum. First, just let me note that generally at FCC, aside from the economists, there isn't all that much concern about the notion of why you might want to define boundaries in a way to facilitate secondary market transactions. But economists, care about this, and you care when you have this sort of crazy quilt pattern of the way that the property rights are defined. It affects one, the initial allocation with auctions. If the licenses are not fungible, it affects the efficiency of the initial assignment. And then if licenses aren't fungible for other reasons in terms of the way boundaries are defined, it greatly impedes secondary market transactions. Now, I wanted to just talk about what the FCC has done that's directly parallel to what you talked about in land. First of all, it's important to note the obvious, particularly since this is the 50th anniversary of Coase's 1959 data on the FCC, is that spectrum has at least one additional dimension in property besides the two geographic dimensions. There's also a frequency dimension. The first one, we just talked about the geographic dimension of spectrum rights. You might think that at least in recent years, the FCC would try to line up the geographic dimensions of different licenses so that they would be aligned, as you talked about. And if you want to aggregate it in a simple way, there wouldn't be these overlaps in different frequency dimensions. But this is not true. I mean, we have at least three different geographic systems.
Yes, we'll try to wrap it up pretty soon. It's quite interesting that some others will ask questions.
All right, well, anyway, let me just point out that there's something to be learned from the land situation, and we're looking at trying to move towards a more uniform system.
Thanks very much. I appreciate that insight, so I'll be back in touch. Yeah.
Yes, question over here.
Hi, George Priest from Yale. My paper was very interesting, and I don't know this literature at all. But I wonder if you should look more intensely at historical changes in land use and land technology over time. Because it seems to me, actually, your approach is really contrary to Ronald's spirit. And the way Ronald approaches problems in the sense that you're claiming that except for these land development ethics, a government-mandated program or organization is superior over what individuals would do in the market, which I think Ronald, as a general matter, would not agree to. But it seems to be contrary to Ronald's general approach. That it may be historical, there may be some historical reasons and land technology reasons to explain these differences. That is, perhaps meets and bounds makes more sense with a superior under one level of land use technology, but becomes obsolete and counterproductive under some later level
Well, actually, that's right. If I don't know if this is on or not. Can you hear me? Yeah. Anyway, as I mentioned earlier, the push towards a rectangular survey really comes about as the time of lots of new developments in agriculture, especially in field production that required squares. But just more broadly, new transportation technologies, development of urban sectors and so forth. Land just now has to be used a lot more efficiently than in the past because it's more valuable. And so now you want it, with these production technologies, you want it in shapes that you can use it more productively, as well as for trade. And so that it's these forces that are coming together to lead to the emphasis on the rectangular survey. And that's really part of the enclosure movement literature. So, I don't disagree with that. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I think this is Michael being NYU. I think this is a terrific paper, really interesting, and this is a minor point. I wonder if there's a variable for the heterogeneity of land use demand. In other words, it's one thing to divide up a flat plain in squares for farming. It's another if people are doing all sorts of different things. You have a terrain variable. And it would seem to me there's a loss. That doesn't mean on balance there's a loss. But there's a loss to the extent that the rectangular grid doesn't fit very well the heterogeneity of the system.
John?
Yeah, I agree. Actually, we're incorporating that. Just as an aside, another aspect of this project is we're looking at urban lands. And there, with agricultural lands and minerals and so forth, because there are fewer land transactions on net, it's much easier to accommodate these alternatives, but not with urban land. You see urban land going from meets and bounds to grids all over. You never see, except in upscale suburban developments, you never see grid areas going to meets and bounds in urban areas.
Yes.
You talk about the surface of the land and the effective scale effects, but of course, one of the very important uses of land is subterranean. There's oil and gas and mining rights and so forth. And one of the great challenges that I think we have is that oftentimes the scales are completely different for surface efficient use and subsurface use. And so one of the questions I'm curious about is after you get this meets and bounds system, does it not only facilitate roads and infrastructure, but what about oil and gas pooling and leases, various kinds of mining sorts of arrangements? Do you have any sense as to how those activities are impacted by the various constellations on the services? And if they are not done by voluntary organizations, what about the use of eminent domain powers in trying to reconfigure the land so as to deal with difference in scales effects?
Sure, Richard. Anything that, because subterranean uses don't match surface uses and so forth, you might have to consolidate in order to address these, wherever the oil or water or whatever it is, the mineral happens to flow. Anything that facilitates this kind of surface consolidation or surface negotiations is going to lower the transactions costs of dealing with those subterranean activities. And this is inherent in the rectangular survey.
John?
Gary, John Nye. I wonder if you were worrying a little bit about what the government demand is for the credibility and how you say follow through in terms of making the survey important. In the sense that I'm looking at a project in the Philippines now where there's a lot of missing survey and mapping data, but it turns out in one city where they've perfectly mapped it, there's a disjunction between the mapping and satellite data and the survey data and the land title. So very often the title will list the property as being in the ocean. But they already know where it really is, but they don't want to use that, and so they have the land charge of the title annotates the land title, and that's what's used. Whereas in contrast, there's a separate government agency that's in charge of surveys, and they don't want to reconcile the two.
Yes, as a matter of fact, as I mentioned, as one of our control variables, to no surprise, the most extensive adoption of the grid across the British Empire is done, and in the U.S., well, except for the Western lands, is done by land companies. Because they, if they could acquire enough land, they subdivide it, they put it into a grid, and life goes on. And they internalize those gains, so I'm not, and they have credibility, so I'm not, I think it's consistent with your observation.
Yes, PJ, behind you. Okay. You can turn behind.
I'm sorry.
Okay, Miroslav Zajic from the University of Economics in Prague.
Okay.
I just want to give you a small suggestion. The process you described in your paper is pretty similar to the one that happened actually in the 13th century in Central Europe when the cities were founded. Founded city is not, in a Central European sense, at that time, was not just to gather people together because the settlements with a lot of people were already there. To settle a city or found a city was simply to make grid, to draw a line, usually even on the places where the original settlement already had been, and use that, intuitive methods of drawing the borders between the lands and settlements. So what they usually did, the king or another powerful man, was not necessarily the king, simply made the locator who as an entrepreneurial activity draw the grids and draw those real estates and started to sell it. And usually with the original settlements. But there were situations where two title cities, the original one with the intuitive way of drawing borders, and the new one, were simply founded on the same or similar place. And after 100 years, the older cities were actually vanished, and the new ones with those grid systems actually survived. There are several cases of that. Now it's really complicated after about 600 years. But in the center of those originally founded cities, you still see the grid system, which has been surprising in Europe.
Yeah, thank you. That actually is part of our urban grid, which is another aspect of this process, which, by the way, one prediction is cities that are destroyed, if they were old meets and bounds, come back as grids. And at least in all of our observations, that's the case. So if they're old meets and bounds medieval cities, and then there's some destruction, war, or whatever, they come back as a grid, so it lowers the cost of reallocating.
Yes, next.
Tom Merrill here. This is really terrific. I love this work. I think you sort of identified two different benefits of grids. One is sort of information costs. It lowers the cost of transacting and enforcing property rights. And the other is kind of a production function that you mentioned, that it's easier to turn the plow around if the corners are square, and you can't build up triangular plots in urban areas and so forth. I'm just curious if you think there's any way to tease out the relevant magnitude of those two benefits. One thing that occurs to me is if you keep doing this work for another 10 years, which I hope you do, you may actually have a way of testing that, because I think as we have like satellite photography, some of which you've already taken advantage of, GPS location systems and fully digitalized land records, that the information cost advantages of the grid versus the means and mouse system may largely disappear. And so in those circumstances, you might be able to test the informational advantages versus the production advantages of these two different systems.
Yeah, I agree with you, and to be able to, we're trying to think of ways to tease out these differential contributions, the production side as compared to the broader informational, because the production is going to, although it gets capitalized into land values, it's going to be more internalized by the individual occupant. The broader are more of a public good as well.
PJ?
Gary, one of the things you have in there is population density. That certainly makes a big difference. It's a distributional question where you have present land occupants is going to be an interesting one. It would be over time, as you try to check this, as you try to work with that, if you can introduce another one in terms of different ways of closing the rectangular survey on existing occupants. You may get different results depending on how you solve the problem of people that are there. You might be able to have a sub-variable there that would say the rectangular survey is opposed on population under certain circumstances, compensation, previous claims, those sorts of things. Or under another, when there's no population density, the land money is fairly straightforward. But the distribution issue is going to be huge in areas where you do have present occupants. I'm just wondering if some differences that you can find how that would get closed.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Actually, of course, the problem gets dealt with, in North America, U.S. and Canada, by pushing the native population aside. The population densities are low. That's not so easily done in East Africa and Kenya and Rhodesia. But at least where we have settlement information now and settlement maps, they pushed the natives aside and made this land available only to Europeans, and then made, so far as I understand, made no effort to impose a rectangular survey in the so-called native areas. They sort of maintained what they called customary native practices. Now, of course, these are no longer so desirable an area to be in, but the costs of imposing this on existing land holdings, I think, are large. And I think it, if you look, I didn't show it here, but if you look at meets and bounds still dominates in the eastern U.S. For agricultural land, even though we demonstrate fairly significant land value changes for agricultural land. There's not wholesale movement towards a grid in agricultural land in the eastern U.S., so the costs of doing this must be sufficiently high, the individual costs and the uncertainties associated, that they swamp the advantages that we observe.
Yes, Roger?
Yeah, I'd like to relate this. First of all, Evan really did have a question with
I actually have lots of notes.
And it's also related to your work on water and land, which is as follows, that there's a simultaneity problem between the creation of a rectangular grid and the ability to transact land without restraints as to its use and its ownership. All right? To analogize the spectrum problem to the land problem is things like the water rights. If you want to have the subsidized water, the Bureau recommendation that you have to have land aggregated into small units. So the interesting question has to do with if we compare meets and bounds areas with the rectangular survey areas, like in California with the old California land grants. Initially, when that happened, there were restrictions on the ability to transfer title within the Spanish land grants, and there were restrictions on the use of the land, which weren't present. And how can you see a way to disentangle that? How much of the value of the rectangular survey was due to the fact it was a more efficient way to aggregate property rights, and how much of it was to the fact that you didn't have these restrictions on use of ownership?
Right. Well, for one thing, as I mentioned, we don't encounter these problems with our Ohio case. So that's our strongest test case. And we're still, we have a number of measures to try to control for the uncertainty and the constraints on transfers within the Mexican and Spanish land grants. But they're just not sufficient because that gives us, the values are implausibly high, the differences. And so we're still working on that. Yeah, I agree. One last question. Yes, Rob.
Rob Stevens, Harvard. Gary, very interesting. What looks like a fantastic data set. My question, I think, is perhaps a generalized version of Roger's question, and that is that back on one of those slides, I recall the word either exogenous variable, the phrase exogenous variable or dependent variable. When I look down the list and I listen to a lot of discussion, there's tremendous endogeneity. And so, and to me, that's the most interesting part of this.
Yeah.
And so, do you have an empirical strategy for addressing the endogeneity and sorting it out? Rogers was a special case of it, but there's a lot beyond that.
Yeah, no. And we're aware, to say that we have figured out how to do all of these, we're not yet, but we're aware of these endogeneities, and we'll have to have a strategy if we're going to come up with, so any kind of results that are meaningful.
I wanted to say just one thing about Gary's paper he didn't mention. The per capita incomes and the kind of social development in the area of Ohio that had the meets and bounds was substantially lower. Right.
Not at the time.
Not at the time.
At the time, it was the richest part of Ohio.
But subsequently, it's the poorest part of Ohio now. Yeah. I think we can all agree it's been a very good session. Let's give them a hand.